Hello viewers, and welcome to a new series which I will be conducting alongside Cybersecurity Explained, and that is a brand new Linux series. Now, to those of you out there who are hoping to work in the IT industry or even the cybersecurity industry, then at least to know about Linux is essential. So this presentation will be about what Linux is, where you would find it, and whether you should use it or not. So first of all, what is Linux? So Linux is an extensive group of open source Unix-like operating systems based on the Linux kernel, which was first released on September the 17th, 1991 by Linus Torvalds. It was originally developed for PCs, but has since been ported to more platforms than any other operating system ever. And Linux isn't a single operating system, but rather a family of operating systems. Now, these variants are called distros, short for distributions, or flavors, and there are thousands of them. So, for example, many reputable Linux distros include Ubuntu, Debian, Fedora, Arch Linux, and Mint, or Linux Mint. So, what is the kernel? So the Linux kernel is a computer program at the core of a computer's operating system and has complete control over everything in the system. It is responsible for connecting the application software to the hardware of a computer, it handles the startup, and reads and writes the memory. So in short, it is the very foundation of Linux, and every distro includes the kernel. However, some versions may actually modify it to perform specific functions. So the kernel was, as I mentioned before, created by Linus Torvalds in 1991 as a free alternative to Unix, and that is why Linux is Unix-based. So on the picture on the left, we have Torvalds himself, and he's displayed the Linux kernel. And then on the right, we have the famous penguin Tux, who is the official mascot of the kernel. However, in recent years, Tux just represents Linux as a whole, not just the kernel. So Linux is omnipresent, it's everywhere. Linux is ubiquitous, and although only 2% of computer users actually use Linux on PCs, it is used on server computers, embedded systems, and mobile devices. For example, the Android operating system is a modified version of the kernel. Linux is so widespread that basic modifications of it can run on embedded systems, including the Internet of Things devices built into the firmware. So many of you at home may have an Internet of Things device such as a smart doorbell or a smart vacuum cleaner or even a smart fridge. Well, these electronic devices obviously need an operating system to operate, so it will use some form of Linux that has been tailored specifically for that device. That's how common Linux is in today's world of technology. And just jumping back to the Android part that I mentioned earlier, some of you here may have an Android phone. Well, Android is simply a version of Linux tailored for touchscreen mobile devices. So some of you here may use Linux without even knowing. So let's put this into perspective to show how many versions of Linux exist. Now, this slide includes pretty much the most notable and recognizable versions of Windows. As you can see, not many exist, only 8 here, but that's Windows 11. It's been announced, I guess that's 9 now, but my point still stands, not very many. And here's Linux. So the image situated on the top left is just a small handful of what Linux has to offer. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of these distros, and they're all tailored to perform specific functions to your every need. For example, if you want an operating system that manages your workload, then Fedora or Red Hat's for you. Or maybe you just want a distro for gaming, so Pop! OS exists as well. Or maybe if you just want a jack of all trades, then Ubuntu exists. And the best way to look at Linux is to imagine it like a family tree. The image on the right outlines the main distributions based off the kernel. So let's look at Ubuntu, for example. The image on the right outlines many more flavors, but they're just based off Ubuntu. So there's Kubuntu, Ubuntu, etc. So they're variants based off a variant, which are based off the kernel. So I just want you to emphasize that there are hundreds of these versions of Linux, and that's just based off one distro, and it's mind-blowing. Moving on. we need to consider the advantages and disadvantages of Linux, as well as a conclusion, which I'll show in the next slide, on whether you should use it. First of all, it's open source. It's completely free, so it's not really a financial investment, and you can use it for as long as you want. Unless, of course, you're paying for proprietary software like versions of Red Hat, and even free versions such as Kali Linux and Fedora, which are in fact used in the work industry. Different OS for your choosing, extremely versatile, yep. You can basically find what's out there for you and what distro is tailored for your needs. Very secure, yep. Although Linux does occasionally encounter bugs and are difficult to troubleshoot, they are normally rare. Linux distributions are stable, and non-LTS versions have frequent updates with the latest bug fixes. Additionally, Linux prioritizes your security and privacy, and there are locks in every layer which prevents your system from getting hijacked. Absolute freedom over your system. You can customize, tweak your operating system as much as you want. There are also desktop environments that you can choose from with hundreds of themes and docs. Linux is lightweight with no bloatware or pre-installed heavy applications that limit your productivity. Intuitive. So if you know the basics, Linux is the easiest operating system to use. Linux can be even easier than Windows to use if you know how to operate the shell. Not very resource intensive. Linux systems are very low on resources and can run on as little as 256 megabytes of RAM and on 10 gigabytes on a hard drive. Linux uses resources efficiently and can run on low-spec hardware quickly, so if you're having performance issues with Windows, then maybe you can consider switching to Linux because the chances are it will run much smoother. Okay, moving on to disadvantages, there is a lack of technical support. So most developers of Linux distributions are community-based and therefore do not offer technical assistance or support. However, proprietary versions such as Red Hat do offer this service. So you're paying for the service, so they have every right to make sure that you're using it properly. Unsupported hardware. Yeah, this is a major issue with Linux because there is no concept for drivers. So in Windows, you buy a new peripheral like a microphone, for example. You plug it in, and then Windows looks online and installs the respective drivers for you. However, in Linux, all the drivers and the ability to connect to these peripheral devices are built into the kernel itself. And the kernel cannot have drivers for every single piece of hardware, especially new ones. So this raises a compatibility issue. Devices that are normally affected are external printers and network cards. Hard learning curve. Although I said earlier that Linux can be the easiest operating system to use, you need to get past the hard part first. So in order to use Linux efficiently, you need to learn the shell, which is normally the bash language, so you can consult with the system in a command line. So difficult to troubleshoot. Since only 2% of computer users actually use Linux on PCs, it may be difficult to find solutions to problems online, and if not, the user will probably have to deal with these issues themselves. So if you're thinking of switching to Linux, if you encounter problems, expect to deal with them on your own. And finally, generally poor support for games. So popular video games run on Windows DirectX technology, which is not available on Linux, hence Linux misses out. However, gaming platforms such as Steam has done great work to bring more games to the Linux platform. Technology such as Wine and Lutris make gaming on Linux possible, but they are not optimized as they are not running on the platform for which they were made for. So below I've included an example of what the shell looks like using an external application called ScreenFetch, which outlines the system information as well as displaying the respective logo of the distro, made entirely out of ASCII, which is pretty cool. So here I'm using Fedora 34 and it has all the system information on the right. So finally we have the conclusion. Like every operating system, Linux has its pros and cons. However, Linux as a whole keeps upgrading itself, thus getting better after each update. So more users are joining the Linux world, and most of the problems encountered can be solved with intermediate or basic technical experience. You can try Linux by installing virtualization software such as VMware or VirtualBox, which lets you create a virtual machine, so a computer within a computer. Give Linux a try if you wish to learn what it has to offer, or just to see if it can run on your device. Anything I missed or inaccurately explained, please drop a comment. I hope you enjoyed this video. Next time on this series, I will be showing an example of a Linux distro and how to use it. Thank you, I hope you enjoyed, and goodbye.